what a massive welcome to all of you to the Virdis Leadership Series. And here we go again. And this is 2022. Can you believe it? 2022. My goodness. And 2022 is going to be a great year. We all feel it's going to be a great year. We're going to hopefully come out of the last 2 years, and we're going to be doing some great leadership series events. And this is such an event. And welcome to many of you, familiar faces and new. And I normally start at this point by asking my dear friend Natalie just to welcome everyone to the event, and then so I pass it on to Natalie to welcome everyone.
Well, welcome everybody, of course, and we have today Ravnish, and who is going to, I'm sure, do a fantastic presentation and a phenomenal case study where everyone will have to work very hard. So I'm really pleased, Ravnish, that you've accepted and that you are here today. It's lovely. It's really, I'm very grateful, and very grateful that everyone is here to participate. So thank you very much, and enjoy. Have a great time.
So thank you. And in the spirit of our leadership series, we get fascinating speakers to talk about fascinating topics. And today is exactly the same as that again. And we've got Ravnish, who's come to join us today. And he's going to talk, the title of our exploration is really deal making in a pandemic. And maybe this is not something that is normally discussed even. It's a brand new topic because there's not many pandemics that we've been in. So I'm going to introduce Ravnesh and going to say a massive welcome to you. Our plan for today is that we're going to do Ravnesh and I will be exploring some items. Then afterwards we're going to break into a few breakout groups that Maggie's going to be orchestrating, and then we will give you a topic to discuss and then bring you back to the greater group for a wider discussion. So Ravnish, maybe you could introduce yourself, my friend, where you are, what you do, and your thoughts of the day.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you everyone for joining, and also thank you Tony, Maggie, and Natalie for inviting me to this great event. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion with you guys. See a lot of familiar faces as well. Some I've known for many years. Nice to see you again, and of course some new faces that I don't know. So nice to virtually meet you. I even see a couple of Acceleron people, which is amazing. So I'm looking forward to also having this exercise with you guys. So yeah, as Tony said, it's pretty surreal. We're in our 3rd year of this pandemic, but you know, I have to say also it's been pretty remarkable how much it's demonstrated the power of human adaptation. You know, so we've gone through so many different things in our lives and in the work world, you know, have really adapted to how we do things overall. If you look at the biopharma industry as a whole, you know, amazing that clinical trials are still running without really any major disruptions that at least I've heard of. You know, CMC manufacturing still churning out molecules as needed. We're still getting near record number of drug approvals, lots of successful launches. And I don't think BD is any different, really. We're still have to adapt to obviously what the new environment is, and who knows what the new environment is going to be after the pandemic becomes endemic and we all live with it. But certainly during the time when the pandemic was more unknown to us and how we were going to manage it, BD, just like any other function within the biopharma industry, has really been good in terms of adaptation. So I'm just going to talk at least. So just to even further introduce myself, I realize that many of you don't know me, but I've been in the business development field for now over 20 years across many different companies. And my most recent company, Acceleron Pharma, was recently acquired by Merck. And you know, so I don't know what I'm going to do next after I leave Merck, which will happen pretty soon, but certainly looking forward to whatever my next journey is going to be. So I'm going to spend maybe the first 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes to at least give you some general guidelines and principles about you know, how deal making in my experience has been for the past 3 years or so, and just show you a couple of success stories, including of course the acquisition of Acceleron by Merck. And then we'll have a little bit of a workshop where I'll give you guys a problem statement and how we might want to at least think through how to solve for that problem statement, you know, and we're going to break out into groups to make that happen. So that's my plan for today, and looking forward to doing it with you guys.
Fantastic. And Ravnesh, you've got a few slides, so maybe you could
I do.
put the first one up.
Sure. So I first wanted to start with some general principles about how deal making is done, and this is regardless of whether you're in a pandemic or not. And so let me first start with things that are universally, I believe, should be the same. So the first thing is that you want to make sure that your company has strong corporate strategy and goals already set up, and so that your business development framework and roadmap are going to be very much aligned to that. Because if you don't have that top level view of what you're trying to accomplish as a company, then business development is just going to work in a vacuum, which is not going to really benefit anybody.
So maybe just start with one question. I mean,
of course,
those of us who have been in this world for a long time, strategy is clearly a very ambiguous thing nowadays. I mean, your whole conversation is going to be about ambiguity, really. So, I mean, how does that work with needing that fluidity in the word strategy?
Yeah, so the first thing about strategy is that, yes, first of all, it's going to be subjective to every company. They'll have their own way of figuring out what strategy is going to be. But ultimately, what it has to always start with is that what are your ultimate goals as a company? What do you want to do? How do you want to grow? How do you want to sustain yourself? And then work backwards from those goals to figure out how you're going to get there. And usually this strategic planning that needs to be done has to have inputs from many different stakeholders within the company. So in general, it's going to be basically almost every function that is going to have to provide those inputs to make sure that you do achieve those goals in a timely manner. And that also, the timely manner aspect of it is also going to be individual. It's going to be subjected to whatever the company is trying to do, for those goals that they're trying to achieve. So business development, as I said, is going to be one aspect of that as well. And every company is going to have a different view of how important business development is going to be for the company strategy. Some companies are going to think of business development as more secondary to their strategy. Others are going to think that it's actually quite critical to the growth of the company. And whether you're a company that is looking to be on the buy side, where you need to acquire assets or you need to partner with another company to help fill your pipeline, that's one way of doing it. Another is if you're on the sell side, are you trying to monetize your platform in some way because you need some near-term cash? Do you need external validation for your platform because it's so new? Do you need capabilities and resources that it'll take you a while to build on your own? So those things are considerations you would need to have as a sell-side company. So and again, the importance of business development, the level of importance of business development is going to be indicative of how important the whole process of developing a roadmap is going to feed into the strategy of the company. So once you've developed your roadmap, then you start to think about what are the tactics behind that roadmap? How are you going to develop your playground so that you are successful in not just going forward with your process, but also making sure that there's some constraints within what you're playing in. Because if you don't have those constraints, you can play in almost any different direction, and you might end up being distracted more than actually focused on what you need to get done. But I also leave room for what I call planned serendipity, which means that you don't want your playground to be so rigid that you don't consider some transactions that could actually be quite interesting for your company, that you may not have considered, again, if your playground was too rigid. So that's a phrase that I learned from one of my former managers, which I really liked and kept.
Ravnish, you could expand on or give us an example of a focused and an unfocused playground.
Sure. So let's say you're on the buy side and you're a company that is focused on a single therapeutic area. So that's one piece of the criteria that you can put in place, that you only want to be in this one therapeutic area. Now you have to go whittle down a bit deeper into, okay, what does the within the therapeutic area, let's say it's oncology, what disease areas do you want to be in? Oncology is a big area. Is it solid tumors? Is it hematological malignancies? Within solid tumors, are there specific areas you want to be in? Within hematological malignancies, is other specific areas you want to be in? So that's on the therapeutic area side. Then you can think about technology? Do you want to be in small molecules only? Do you want to be in biologics only? In CAR T, other areas? So the narrower your focus is going to be, the better it's going to be for you. And a lot of these focuses are really going to be related to what you can add in terms of the capabilities you currently have. So when you're on the buy side, you have to convince the seller that you have all the necessary resources and capabilities to make sure that their technology is going to be in good hands. And if you don't have those capabilities, it's going to be hard to convince them that you have everything that you need and they need for the asset or the platform, the technology to be successful overall.
And have you, in your experience, do you find that the CEO actually plays an active part in defining the playground, you know, on a, not at a corporate level, but actually on a personal level with the BD guys?
They could, the CEO could, and I think it depends on the size of the company in many ways. So if you're working in a startup, for example, and there's only a handful of you at the company, then the CEO absolutely would need to be involved in how you're going to shape your business development strategy in the playground that you play with. Because that CEO will be, I imagine, very heavily involved in the entire process, you know, from finding a partner to negotiating the deal with them, and then eventually executing on it, and then maintaining the relationship after the execution. Now, if you're in a larger company, then depending on how the CEO operates, that CEO could empower this chief business officer or the head of business development to do the necessary work, you know, to get all the criteria, the playground, the process, everything put in place. And then once it's all done, then you can present that entire strategy, roadmap, process, etc., to your executive team and to your board, get the opinions and inputs that you would need from them to make sure that your process and your strategy is more refined and better. But it doesn't necessarily have to be where the CEO is involved from day one in developing all of it. So one other criteria also I do want to emphasize quite a bit is that once you have your roadmap and your process in place, is that the process in of itself needs to be cross-functional from as early as possible. And in my view, if business development is done in a vacuum, it's not a good process. Because at the end of the day, the deal being signed is only step one. Even though it may feel like you've done so much work to get to that transaction, it really doesn't, it's only the beginning of everything. Once the deal is signed and you actually start the relationship with the other side, that's where the rubber really hits the road. And that's that's why you want a cross-functional process in place, so that the key stakeholders within the company are not only just aware of what's going on, but are ready to take on whatever that new relationship is going to be when the deal is signed. So that for me is extremely critical. And it's not also just about having a cross-functional team in place. They absolutely have to be empowered to make decisions for their functions and have full accountability for those decisions. You know, I've worked in teams where, you know, great cross-functional folks, but you know, every deal or so that I've worked on, they've had to check back with XYZ person about whether it's worth moving forward, and that slows down everything. And to me, I would go back to them and just say, why don't we just have your leader be part of the team? Because that would just make the process a lot more efficient. And that person would be able to make the decision for your function, and we can move forward. So again, a very important part of the process that's needed to make sure that your deal is going to be successful. And then finally, this is more of a catch-all, but just making sure that you have a good internal and external system, and that can mean technology in terms of tracking deals, and also a network, particularly your external network, so that you make sure that you talk to the right people when you're trying to discuss whether a deal is worth having or not. So these are some of the principles, at least in terms of what I think remains the same, regardless of whether you're in a pandemic or not. So I'm going to shift gears and talk about things that had to be enhanced, because we were in a new environment and still are in many ways in a new environment. And how do we make sure that whatever already is in place is going to be better, or it's going to be improved in a way that the process of the deal is going to be successful, still as successful as it was before pandemic, and also it's as efficient as it could be before pandemic. So first thing is that in my view, because in many cases you are not going to be able to meet with anyone in person, that there has to be more of an elevated level of trust between both parties, assuming that you have mutually agreeable goals. And you don't get to see body language, you don't get to make real eye contact as much as you can do in Zoom. It's not the same as in person. You need to make an extra effort to ensure that that level of trust exists from day one, that you're trying to achieve the same goals. So I think that's extremely important.
Ravnish, does that trust come with the clarity of a digital data room? So because in a way there's an expectation that we're now in a digital age, that if I can show an absolutely navigatable data room, that all of a sudden trust goes up? Or is it, I mean, what I'm intrigued by, how do you elevate this trust?
Right. And it's a great question. So it's easier when you know the person already. So if you've met the person from before the pandemic, you've already had a relationship with that person, then at the end of the day, the level of trust shouldn't go down. It should maintain itself because you already have that relationship. The challenge really comes with meeting new people that you've never met in person for the first time. You know, how do you know that this person that you're working with is going to be on the same page with you at all times? You know, you may have a different way of getting to that same goal, but if you share the same goal and you can establish that as early as possible, then you hope that the process, even though it's going to be adversarial in some ways because you have a different way of getting to that goal, that because you have that same level of trust that you want to get to the same place, you can negotiate in a peaceful sort of way, or in a way that you don't have to feel that it's going to be derailed in any way, shape, or form. So, well, how I think about establishing that trust is that you lay out the ground rules from day one about what you're trying to accomplish, and try to be as concrete as possible with your counterpart about what you're trying to achieve. And then keep that level of communication as consistent and as constant as possible. Because if anything changes in those goals, you want to be informed of that as quickly as possible, so that you can pivot and the other side can pivot to whatever needs to be done next. So without those ground rules, I don't think it can be done effectively.
And is that really more structure? It reflected in structure. So
when you say structure, you mean the deal itself, or the structure of the process?
I mean, what we're almost saying is that you've either got a video or you've got an email or a telephone call to contact someone. So in a way, you have to put when you agree on a ground rule or rules of engagement, it has to be almost written down in a structured way so that people get it. And of course, that's quite not necessarily within everybody's style of working, is it? I mean, some people just don't obey rules, you know, and like a good long conversation. So.
Yeah, it's a good point. And yes, it's not typical, obviously, and that you have these sort of ground rules, because we're all professionals at the end of the day, and we all come with our own set of experiences and also what we consider to be the best ways of negotiating a deal. But because of this environment that we're in right now, and we haven't met each other, these ground rules to me are going to be good things that you can refer to if any discussions or any negotiations go off the rails. And so taking the time to do that as early as you can, I think it's just going to benefit you down the road. You know, whether this kind of ground rule setting is going to stay post-pandemic remains to be seen. I mean, I plan to use it as best as I can, particularly with folks that I don't know and I'm talking with for the first time. But it may go the way of the dodo, because you know, we just realized that meeting in person and having all the usual interactions that we used to before the pandemic will do away with all of that, and you try to, you know, do it more informally, that you're trying to establish that trust.
I mean, I suppose one of the questions, I mean, if you're out licensing, it's different, but if you're actually bringing two teams together where there may be some jockeying for jobs, that's going to be very interesting to do digitally.
Yeah, absolutely. You're talking about a merger and acquisition?
Yeah, because
Yes.
it's like, you know, I'm meeting my counterpart who could be my boss, and
Could
I
be.
don't even know them.
Yeah, and in M&A situations also you don't necessarily, it's generally the most senior teams that are involved in the whole process, except for if you were the buyer, then you have to involve a much larger set of team members. But if you're a seller, it's usually the smaller team, and the seller is the one that has to be a bit more cognizant of what's going to happen post-merger, you know, whether somebody wants a job or not. And you're right. So it's during the negotiation process, you can't see that person as somebody that's going to be your colleague. It's really more about what is going to be best for stakeholders, what is going to be the best outcome for the company as a whole. And then once the deal is signed, then you start figuring out the details of the integration process.
Interesting.
Yeah, so trust, again, very important. And the rest of it is really more the mechanics behind it. So we've already touched on communications. Obviously, you want to keep that going as best and as quickly as possible, because things are going to pivot at all times. Particularly if you're a smaller company, strategies will change very quickly because you're getting new data almost on a daily or weekly basis. So you want to make sure that you're frequently communicating that, etc. So, and then thinking about information exchange is something you touched on, Tony, as well, about data rooms. So, you know, having a good, robust data room is already something that you should have pre-pandemic, but post-pandemic is even more important because you don't get a chance to meet people face to face. So your data room is essentially the only way you know, and the only way you can get access to the information that you need. Without meeting anyone in person, you know, or you know, looking through primary documents, for example, which are harder to get into data rooms because they're usually notebooks or things that are handwritten. You have to, that level of trust that I was talking about earlier has to be even more so, that what you're reading and what you're seeing is exactly what is being presented. So that's that's just the data room part of it, and then there's the negotiation process as well. You know, that also needs to be more efficient because you're trying to get to a deal at you know, during a specific time, and where you have, now that you're on Zoom, you can actually meet more frequently because you don't have to travel as much anymore. You don't have to go to a specific site anymore, and you know, you can get on the phone or you can get on a Zoom call, you know, much more on a dime versus all the things that you would have to do that are more logistically challenging.
Interesting.
And then I talked about the due diligence process as well. So that comes with, you know, as I said, data room and things like that. And then finally, also importantly, there is, in my experience, also more of a heavy reliance on external advisors. And the external advisors give you more firepower when it comes to negotiations or when it comes to the due diligence process. Because sometimes, you know, we're working on so many different things. As deal makers, you have to get access to people that have their own day jobs, right? So whether it's a finance person, a marketing person, it's an R&D person, they're doing their own jobs in their daily lives. So business development becomes another thing that they have to do. So in cases where you don't get access to them because of these day jobs that they have, the external advisors can be a good help to get some of those things done. And they can be consultants that you employ, they can be your bankers if it's an M&A situation, they're your lawyers when it comes to negotiations. So those also are very important resources that you want to make sure that you have.
I mean, this is running a process, isn't it? And I suppose the question, I suppose the question is the BD unit responsible for the first part where they, if you like, track and pull in the person for the transaction, and then almost it becomes the external advisors who do the transaction?
It depends on the company. So in my experience, if you're a very small company with limited resources, then your external advisors become even more important, because you generally don't have the internal resources to get the deal done in an effective of a way as you could if you were with a larger company that does have the resources. So with a larger company, you can pull in, assuming again their day jobs are not taking up all of their bandwidth. You can pull in those internal resources to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and rely a little less on your external advisors.
Interesting.
So these are the general principles that I wanted to convey to all of you before I just jump into at least some of the success stories that I can talk to you about. And then we can jump into the workshop. Do we want to have a Q&A here for anything, or do we want to jump into the next part of it?
Let's move into the success stories, and then we can look at the time.
Sure, no problem. So these are just a couple of success stories that I just wanted to highlight to you in terms of my experience working in a pandemic. You know, it obviously it won't talk about all the deals that we did work on that are either not quite successful in the sense that they didn't transact because you know, the other side walked away or we walked away, or the transactions that are still imminent but are not quite signed yet. But these are the ones that you know, over lots of ups and downs when it came to the pandemic, they did manage to come to fruition. So the first one I want to talk about is when I was at Sage not too long ago, and we signed a deal with Biogen to essentially work together to develop the 2 lead assets that we had at Sage. So this was just over a $3 billion deal. Most of it was in cash, and then there was some royalty payments that were put in the back burner as well. It's a 50-50 profit share of the 2 lead assets in the US, and there's an ex-US license for most territories. So this was a particularly interesting deal to work on because it did go through lots of different ups and downs. You know, most deals do, of course, it's not unique to that. But when it's in the middle of a pandemic, structurally also the deal changed quite a bit. And actually this is going to be a little bit of a lead-in or a little bit of a preview of the exercise that we're going to work on together about how a pandemic could change what the scope of a deal can look like, and whether it's still worth transacting on, depending on whether your goals have shifted because of the pandemic. So this is a good example of that, you know, without going into the details about what exactly happened. And then the second deal, just to bring it here as well, you know, a couple of Acceleron people are here, and you know, also I'm sure very proud of what we accomplished here. You know, we sold our company to Merck late last year for $11.5 billion. So they came after us for a couple of our flagship assets. One is commercialized with BMS for several kinds of anemia, and another one is the one that we're developing on our own called sotatercept for a rare disease called pulmonary arterial hypertension. So this was the second largest biopharma deal of 2021. So you know, we're very proud of that. I think there was CSL that bought V4 Pharma about a month after for maybe $200 million more than what we transacted on. So
just a couple of things, Ravnish. So
of course,
when were these? If you talk about that thing you described called controlled serendipity, or if you like, first contact, we'll put it in a spaceship kind of thing. When was first contact with Sage and Biogen and Acceleron and Merck? Was it years back?
Not years, no. So for Sage Biogen, it was between the time that we first chatted with them to when we transacted, it was nearly a year. Not quite a whole year, but nearly a year. So certainly before the pandemic started, but not too much longer before that. And then for Acceleron to Merck contacted us last summer. So it was a few months before we transacted with them.
Did you have any signals of tracking for years before?
When I was at Sage with Biogen, yes. Over the years, they had, you know, from time to time contacted us or wanted to talk with us, etc. But we never really got to do anything with them until this deal happened. Yeah. With Merck, no. Merck actually, from my knowledge, they had never reached out to us to do anything with us.
And was there a trigger to Merck, you know, change of management or you know, desire to get into something else? Can you put your finger on the trigger that got them interested?
I can speculate. I don't know all the details. This one piece of speculation I have is that new management, I think, was a big driver for it. You know, the CEO is new relatively. So Ken Frazier had retired from CEO after, I think, being there for over a decade. and become executive chairman. So Rob Davis being a new person. And then their head of R&D is also a new person. He came from academia not too long ago after Roger Perlmutter retired from his position as well. So it's pretty common for new management, particularly in pharma, that they want to make a big splash after they have assumed their new positions. And one of the big splashes you can do is to go buy something big.
Yeah. Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, so that's speculative though on my part. So that's having said that, let me jump into the exercise that I think we can hopefully have fun working together. Of course.
What I'd suggest to the folks who are present is that if you have any particular burning questions, that you maybe put them in the chat room just so that we can remember them afterwards. Maggie, just looking at the timing, it's 4:35. Are we ready to start thinking about moving into the next phase, or shall we wait a little while?
No, we can go into the breakout rooms if Ravneesh just wants to introduce his problem.
Ravneesh, if you can introduce the problem, and then as I say, if people can put any particular questions, and we might get a chance to cover them later. So Ravneesh, firstly, thank you very much for that. That was very insightful, and we really appreciate it. So let's now move into what your problem statements are.
Sure. So let's start with that. The problem statement is that you, whether you're a buyer or a seller, are in deep negotiations for what you've already established to be a mutually attractive deal, and now face a sudden difference in the perceived valuation of the asset because you've now are experiencing an unexpected macro event, aka a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. So now the question is, assuming the transaction is still worth pursuing in some form, and I'm making that as an assumption, it may be that it's not, but let's say that it is, how would both sides, so both the buyer and the seller, think about narrowing this new gap in the perceived valuation of the asset?
Is that up or down? It's gone up or down?
I will say that because of a pandemic, using that as an example, it's gone down, particularly from the buyer side. But on the seller side, the value still maintains itself because the fundamentals of it has not changed.
Okay.
So those are the two breakout rooms that at least I've thought that we could do. We can have a buyer group and a seller group to see how you're going to be able to convince each other that the valuation, the new valuation is something that either should stay because of the pandemic, or should it go back to what it was, or somewhere in between. And
have you got any, I mean, you know, is there any view you have on therapeutic area? Because it might be very different if it was a vaccine or a delivery.
Sure. Yeah. So let's say it's unrelated to the pandemic. It's unrelated to the vaccine or COVID or anything like that. It would be, let's pick oncology.
Okay.
Yes.
And okay, got it.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Fantastic. So thank you again, my friend. We're going to move into phase 2 in the event and ask Maggie, maybe you could, or Ravnish, could you please take the slides off so we can see everybody's face? Thank you again. And what I'm going to suggest is that Maggie, you take the baton to move us around, which would be fantastic.